Item on our agenda is the Via Verde EIR scoping hearing. I want to remind everybody that we're not reviewing the project, we're not approving the project. All we're doing is trying to make sure that the environmental impact report that will be done covers all of the essential items that have been raised and that people think ought to be in there. So we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about the merits of the project. We're just trying to size and scope the environmental impact review. Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we get started, I just wanted to announce that I did have a ex parte meeting with the project's architects, Keith Nolan and Justin Van Mullen. They wanted to explain their prior research on the question that I raised at the last meeting regarding the potential for a parking garage structure. So that's it.
Okay, Mr. Cato.
Peter Lawson will be doing the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To give you a brief history before I begin my presentation, initial study and draft mitigated declaration was prepared and circulated on February 23rd, and comment period ended on March 16th. It was brought before your commission on March 5th, and comments received during that period at your commission caused us to reconsider the level of environmental review. We decided to go ahead and prepare a focused EIR. A notice of preparation has begun, and that began on May 22nd. And a new initial study accompanying that notice of preparation was prepared. I realized the comments that we received on previous initial study are not being carried forward for this initial study, which I understand causes some frustration that a lot of people put work into commenting on that previous document. But our hope is that we have addressed a lot of the comments on the previous document. So why we're here today is to receive comments from public agencies, community interest groups, members of the public, and the Planning Commission on the scope of the environmental impact report. So the EIR be prepared for the project the project site is located at 900 Calle de los Amigos, and it encompasses an area adjacent to City Park, and to the south it crosses over Torino Road. And the project would be for amending a conditional use permit to allow 40 additional two-bedroom units, upgrade facilities, renovate approximately 10,400 square feet, expand the buildings by a total of 14,900 feet, and construct 3 gazebos. There'll be a new access road onto Torino for 8 out of the 40 units, reconfigured on-site parking, 2 new staff parking lots, provide additional parking, 56 uncovered, 37 covered. Demolition would be for the hospice building, a single-family resident, 4 multifamily residential, maintenance building, 4 gazebos, and some parking areas demoed and relocated. Tree removal and grading will be removed 15 oaks, 6 additional oaks and 1 sycamore may be impacted. Remove 80 non-native, and grading will be approximately 11,000 cubic yards of cut and 13,000 of fill, and approximately 1,700 of import. The applicant will go through the project in a little bit more detail, but generally the project will be located within the footprint of the existing campus, except for 14 independent living units on the upper side of the campus, 10 near Torino, and 4 over towards the golf course area. So in terms of the environmental review process steps, we've prepared an initial study. Notice of EIR preparation has been issued. The 30-day comment period would go through June 22nd, and today we're doing the scoping hearing. So the steps that we go through is after the close of the comment period, we receive comments, we'll go ahead and put out a request for proposal, RFP, for environmental consultant. Draft environmental impact report will be prepared. Once that's done, we'll have a comment period again for about 45 days. And during that 45-day period, we'll have a hearing at your commission, finish up the EIR, include written responses to the comments, and then come back to your commission for final EIR certification and action on the project. So accompanying the notice of preparation is an initial study, and the purpose of that is to provide analysis of the project's impacts. It provides the scope for the EIR, explains why some impacts are not included in the EIR. It also includes mitigations that will be incorporated into EIR and then eventually as conditions of approval in the project. I've also received some comment about the fact of why are we not preparing a full EIR. And as an example, here's some items that issue areas that we've determined no further analysis is required. So one example would be cultural resources, and we have received an archaeological report and a historic report on the house to be demolished. Both reports came back negative, that there were no archaeological resources and that the existing farmhouse to be demolished is not considered significant. Therefore, we just have a recommended mitigation for the archaeological resource and didn't rise that level of significance that required further analysis in the EIR. And that's what we came across in some of these other impact areas. And that's the reason why we have a focused EIR proposed on two issues, which is biology and all aspects of biology, which is oak woodland and wildlife habitat. And we're going to look at development of the new condos, associated fire clearance, reduction in wildlife corridor, to see what impacts will come out. We'll also look at transportation, and the focus is on long-term vehicle trips associated with the project. And this is a shot of the area of what's called Rutherford and the existing farmhouse and the part of the oak woodland habitat that's being looked at in the EIR. So public comment period is for 30 days. It began on the 22nd of May, ends on the 22nd of June. You can go ahead and submit written comments to me at P.O. Box 1990, Santa Barbara, CA 93102, or go ahead and email me, and I'll let you read that. So with that, my recommendation is that we receive comments from both you as well as the public on the scope of the EIR and give us some feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Does the applicant have any words that they want to say?
We do. Good evening, Chair Thompson, Commissioners. I'm Ron Schaefer, Executive Director of Valle Verde Retirement Community. And I'm pleased to share with you some of the environmental aspects of the current proposal for our project. As you know, this project has a growing history of design iterations. The current proposal, which you have before you tonight, is representative of many years of collaborative work with professional design and senior living consultants, the Valle Verde residents, and our city planning process. In the midst of this design effort, Valle Verde adopted its Green Initiative, a comprehensive effort to increase our environmental sensitivity in both physical plant and operational practices, covering areas like utility consumption, recycling efforts, and purchasing practices. We have been working towards our goal of being carbon neutral by the year 2020. One action that we have taken directly from the input of this Commission has been our incentive program to increase employee ride sharing. Valle Verde's Green Initiative has earned many city, state, and national awards for being a pioneer in these areas. Ultimately, our intent is to be a good neighbor to the citizens of Santa Barbara through the fulfillment of our mission and through our enduring commitment to environmental concerns. This commitment has been evidenced by our responsive design process that has led to the proposal you now have in front of you. These past 3 years, we have worked creatively and diligently with input from you, the city staff, and the Board of Architectural Review to create a project that has little to no unmitigated environmental impacts, a success that the city's own environmental analyst concurred with the last time we were here. At that hearing, however, it was apparent that the Commission wanted to ensure that a couple of potential concerns were adequately studied. In the spirit of being a good neighbor, we concurred. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to our consultant biologist, Lawrence Hunt, to discuss some of the biological aspects of our project.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Lawrence Hunt. I'm the biologist that prepared the biological assessment for this project, and I just wanted to very briefly address 3 issues that were raised in a letter that was written to you by Brian Troutwine, as well as some comments from the last Commission hearing. And those 3 impact areas are the possibility of surveys that I conducted for the biological assessment missing some special status species, possible impacts to oak woodland, and possible impacts to wildlife movement, wildlife corridors. I'll address the first issue. Let's go back to that first slide. I'll address the first issue. The site itself, where the project footprint is going to occur, is chronic. I characterize it as chronically disturbed area. It was farmed for a number of decades, walnuts, citrus crops, and since that time it is kept in a fairly disturbed condition by mowing. There was a issue raised about the timing of my surveys, and even I, in the biological assessment, said that I may have missed some special status species because of the timing of the surveys. But since that time, in 2007, 2008, I've gone out there several times of the year when you would find those and did not see them in the project area footprint. We have the next slide, please. The second area that was discussed in the letter was the issue of impacts to oak woodland habitat. In my professional opinion, there are no impacts to oak woodland habitat per se. 15 oak trees are going to be removed from the project. These are isolated trees that occur in the project area footprint. The state definition of oak woodland is a closed canopy forest. And we have closed canopy forest in certain areas, most notably on the other side of the road over here, but even in the preserve, there's patches of oak woodland closed canopy. The trees that are going to be removed are isolated individual trees, and I should mention only 3 of those are greater than the county or city standard for removal. The other point that should be made is that the restoration recommendations that I put together in the biological assessment would result in a 1.2 acre increase of oak woodland and coastal scrub habitat, most notably in other areas of open space that are left on the Rutherford parcel and then along the edge of the existing oak woodland preserve. Next slide, please. The last point I'd like to put to rest is this idea that the project is somehow going to interfere with wildlife movement. In any discussion of wildlife movement, a biologist has to look at the spatial configuration of the project area in relation to existing development and other patches of open space. Val Verde's been here for decades, so if there's any movement of wildlife from the preserve to, say, Arroyo Burro Creek or to areas such as this, it's already occurred with much of the development that happened decades ago. The project is going to be focused in the open space areas here. It'll be focused in this region here and along this portion of the project site, there will still be open space in here so that if animals are actually moving through the area, they could still negotiate this area. There are other places for animals to move from this habitat out to other open space areas, either along the golf course or whatever. But again, one must ask themselves, what species are we dealing with and where are they going to? The species that are going to be in this area are urban generalist species, raccoons, skunks, deer, possum, things like that, coyotes. And I will guarantee that residents have seen all of those species moving through Val Verde at one time or another. So that this is more or less a semi-permeable landscape that these animals are moving in. Areas that are open space that would allow clear movement are not going to be affected by the project. So in my mind, this is a red herring, really, the idea of wildlife dispersal, interruption to that. Specifically, there was one thing brought up in the letter, and that was a wildlife trail that was in this area that would be impacted. I think one of the residents previously spoke that they created and maintained that trail. It's actually a footpath through this area, and sure, wildlife will use it. Rather than crashing through the brush, they'll use open space or whatever, but that footpath is not going to be affected by the project, and they could still access open space over here if they chose to do so. So that pretty much summarizes my comments. I'll introduce Scott Schell, who will talk about traffic and parking issues.
Good evening, Commissioner. Scott Schell with Associated Transportation Engineers. And as Mr. Hunt said, I'm going to be touching on the traffic and parking statistics. We'll start with traffic. As you probably remember from the last hearing on the project, the initial study analyzed traffic impacts of the project and found that there would be no significant impacts. Of course, the EIR is going to more fully examine that issue. The standard that was used to assess those impacts is the city's standard of looking at 5 critical trips to an impacted intersection. So to look into this a little bit further, we prepared a little trip generation analysis for the project, and of course it looks at the new senior housing units that are proposed, and it takes into account the units that are going to be removed. There's an existing house and some other units that are going to come off the site. The net effect of the project was to generate about 100 trips per day, with 3 trips in the AM peak and 4 trips in the PM peak. These numbers are a little different than those in the initial study in that they're based on the most current version of the Institute of Transportation Engineers trip generation report. We probably have all heard of that one. That report wasn't available at the time the first initial study was published. So the EIR will take a look at that project-specific level of traffic, and will also include a cumulative analysis that looks at the other projects in the Hidden Valley area. Next slide. We heard a little bit about this in the introduction. I just wanted to touch on some of the alternative transportation programs that the campus uses. For residents, we have the shuttle. We've all seen those around town for the residents. There's also a bus stop located on site in front of the administration building. And for the campus, there's electric carts that assist the residents in getting from points A to B without driving. For the employees, also the electric carts for moving on campus. There's a hybrid campus car that is available to employees who do choose to use alternative transportation should they need to go off-site during the day. The campus has enrolled in the Curb Your Commute program with SBCAG and Traffic Solutions. They offer financial incentives to employees to use alternative transportation, and again, the convenient bus stop right at the front door. With respect to the employees, it's important to remember there's 3 shifts for many of them, a 24-hour operation, so not like a typical office where everybody comes in at 8 and leaves at 5. They're really off-peak shifting of the employees. On to parking. There's a new parking lot proposed in the core area of campus, and this slide was put together to show you all sort of how that parking lot here relates to the main entrances where the employees go to, most importantly, punch in their time clock. Yes, there's still a time clock system here. So each of these entrances to the buildings account for about 75% of the total employee entrance and time clock functions. Now, there's some questions about how well this lot and this location would work, so that's why we put this together. Next slide. This one is a comparison to what would happen if you parked on Calle de los Amigos. And I think the intent of this lot up here is to reduce some of the parking that occurs on Calle de los Amigos. We can see the walking distances to the 3 main employee entrances are much further. So we really think that this location and this lot, which is, again, dedicated solely for the employees, will adequately and functionally address some of that street parking One of the issues that we talked about with the campus personnel about why people might park on the street today is because the employee parking is sort of mixed throughout the campus, and it's also shared with residents, staff, and visitors. So sometimes people have to hunt through the campus and circulate around looking for a spot, whereas this new lot is going to provide a dedicated known space that is convenient to park in. We touched a little bit on the underground parking. Commissioner Bartlett mentioned he had some discussions about it. The original engineers, when they looked at it, found that given the proximity of the administration building to the street, we could only get about 15 spaces underground. So even with that, we would still have to provide another major lot on campus. Their proposal also, no laser pointer working today, the dogs ate the batteries. There would be a two driveway system required, which would be somewhat confusing. You'd have to have a driveway to the top and a driveway to the bottom. It would eat up some of the, thank you. It would eat up some of the sidewalk space too, so you'd have this double driveway system, somewhat confusing. Given all of these issues, the underground parking option was sort of dismissed early in the process. The last slide is the overall parking slide. And the parking spaces allocated in blue are the employee parking with the new master plan improvements. So we can see, around the core areas of the buildings where many of the employees want to go. We've got the new dedicated lot. We've got some ancillary parking over here and out in front. So the parking has really been designed to make sure that the peak demand of the employees is met, and it also provides a buffer and a little excess supply so that when that shift change occurs and there's a little extra employees on site for that 15 or 20 minutes, there's a buffer to accommodate those as well. And that concludes my presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Schaefer to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt and Shell. To summarize, this final slide highlights some additional features in our proposal that reduce potential impacts. Grading in our current proposal is at 24,820 cubic yards, which represents a reduction of 47% from our first proposal. Once this project is complete, 67.4% of our campus will be green or open space. The nearest Via Verde building will be 126 feet from our neighbor's fence, an increase of 260% from our first proposal. We will have protected public views along Torino Drive and Calle de los Amigos. Paving in this proposal is 6,579 square feet, a reduction of 79% from our first proposal. This project has better on-site water retention now through the use of basins, pervious surfaces, and filters. On-site parking demand is fully met for staff, residents, and visitors. Our alternative transportation program is active for staff and residents. Our green initiative is pursuing the goal of carbon neutrality by 2020. And our oak woodland habitat will be increased by 1.2 acres, and no oaks will be removed from that habitat. All that we've shared today has been to illustrate the genuine and effective design efforts we've made to eliminate or mitigate all potentially significant environmental impacts of our project. That said, Via Verde understands that the Commission may have continuing concerns, and we look forward to studying those areas through focused environmental impact review. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you for focused and to-the-point presentation that stayed within the time requirement. Before we move on to public testimony, does anyone on the Commission have questions for the staff or the applicant? Mr. Jostis.
I just have a single question now, and I'll get into my other questions. I want to make my comments. Mr. Lawson, did I understand you to say that there's a 45-day review period on the draft EIR? And why would we go beyond the 30-day if there's no responsible agencies at the state level?
There is a responsible agency at the state level.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Justice, we had involved Fish and Game because of the oak woodland habitat as more of a precaution. So that's where we got the state agencies involved.
Okay, so even though they are in an advisory role as opposed to a discretionary role, I mean, do they have discretion? I'm just not sure about that.
No, they don't need to issue any permits, but they are They are, I get confused, trustee of responsible agency under CEQA.
Trustee,
and
I think.
Trustee, and therefore we do solicit their comments when biological impacts may occur to get their input.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll open the public testimony portion. I have quite a few speaker slips. I just want to remind everybody that we're talking mainly about scoping the environmental impact report. First is Heike Killian, and Jim Venturino donated his time, so she's got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Commissioners, for allowing me to present once again. And I wanted to say that we're very pleased to see that this is moving into the realm of the environmental impact reporting analysis. We are a little concerned, though, at the limited scope that's been designated to review this project on. We don't feel that the potential environmental impacts of this expansive project are being addressed adequately with basically 1.5 of the 10 items that can be reviewed. We're concerned that erosion and drainage and the geophysical aspect and category is not being addressed, and we don't understand why parking has been removed from the EIR. I mean, this obviously has been on discussion for several years, and to remove it and not have the opportunity to analyze it and come up with alternatives, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. I'm also concerned, I learned just yesterday that the city uses an abbreviated CEQA guideline, which no longer includes evaluating land use. Without the mandated component, conflicts with underlying land use, zoning consistencies, and general plan conflicts are not identified and mitigated, and this becomes a deficient EIR. If you are reviewing this in context with the CUP needs, since this facility is operating under the CUP, the land use component becomes extremely important to be looking at. As far as some of the other categories that we feel need to be scoped, aesthetics, we've taken a picture outside our gate that we enjoy every day. This is the mountain ridge of Santa Barbara, and the little red sign that you can see on there is about 2 feet behind where the first building is proposed to be. They're asking for modifications of 14 feet, and basically that whole ridge will disappear from us. So we're asking for the visual aesthetics to be reviewed and for any ways that our view can be preserved to us, because we do treasure this view a lot. As you can see, the white building at the that's barely showing is the last row of buildings. That's 29 feet from the curb and 8 feet below street level. So perhaps it needs to be re-examined to bring the buildings down, and that first building is very aggressive to the project and not in keeping with any of the other conforming setbacks. The biological report, we just heard from the gentleman that, the doctor that prepared it, and I just would like to pass out some of the findings that I have from the 1984 environmental impact report that was prepared, and a lot of discussion was done at that point on open space. 3 projects were reviewed in concert. The Hidden Oaks Association, Berkta was trying to build on the hillside, and the annexation of Valverde. And they looked at all of the open space around there, and basically within this EIR worked on them together to create as much open space as possible. And as you can see on the first a sheet that I passed out, this is page 29, they said they wanted to work with these so that the configuration would remain large expanses of open lands rather than isolated pockets. So you can, I didn't make you a copy of the map, but the map shows that there's basically, I think, 60 acres on the side where the Berkta property is on, and then about 20 acres on the other side. There was a review done of this environmental impact report by the county, and that's the second reference that I'm giving you. And they basically are saying that they would like to have the loss of open space looked at cumulatively and the effects, and so this would be something I would like to have scoped in the EIR, such that there are these links between them, so that they aren't isolated pockets, because, you know, we do have migratory animals out there, and they are coming down to the creek to get their water, and they're using the Rutherford property all the time. And we will get you those pictures. I mean, I was told now how to go and get them, to get the light nocturnal cameras and that, but they are going there. And if you build on that and close that off, you are creating isolated pockets, which is not what they were trying to do when they asked to make all this open space in 1985. Also then, as far as that buffer, it's very important, as we've all been talking about for several years, to have that open space buffer between these incompatible land uses, between our residential community and Valverde, and then the other pockets around Hidden Valley, the park, the golf course. The next reference that I made you a copy of is also out of the environmental impact report. And it basically on page 9 talks about the fact that although the proposed zoning of this project, when they annexed the 11 acres and they got approval to build out, was of higher density than the surrounding zoning, the clustering of the units and the open space buffer would reduce this higher density development's conflicts with surrounding land uses and densities. So the buffers are what allowed the project to get approved in 1985. And that buffer is what's kept everything working in harmony back in that valley. And when that buffer starts to close off, that's why we keep coming back talking to you guys. So Rutherford's very important, and the proposed development on there is very aggressive and shuts that down and shuts down the wildlife corridor. Other areas that we'd like you to focus on are the fire hazards, because we've had 3 fires in the area. We have some geological issues. There's a water that seems to be leaking into the park, so we'd like to have that looked at. Erosion, and how are the infill projects going to keep from keeping the ground and storm water from getting into the creek. And then parking, I don't understand why parking was removed from the study. It needs to remain there. It's the density of the project has reflected into the parking. And again, quoting the environmental impact report, they actually were told back then in that expansion that they needed to put in 159 spaces, and they only put in 85. They talked their way out of what you guys told them they needed to have back then. Please don't let them talk you out of it again. We need to solve this problem before the project is expanded on anymore.
Okay, thank you. Jermaine Chastain and Steve Gaither has donated his 2 minutes, so Jermaine has.
And I have another 2 minutes. I don't think I'm going to take them, but just in case. Thank you. The scope of the EIR is much too narrow. While we appreciate that our concerns have forced further investigation of biological impacts and the evaluation of cumulative vehicle trips, it's unfortunate that staff has ignored the fair argument raised in connection with many of the other important categories that we would like to see force the issues of alternatives, such as 2-story elements in their infill zone, which would not affect any views, and a plan that allows for less demolition and one that allows for less density. I begin with the concept of fair argument, which under California law has developed as an extremely low threshold of what is required to trigger an EIR on any particular category. Under California law, the fair argument standard requires that an EIR must be prepared when a fair argument can be raised on the basis of substantial evidence that a project may have a significant adverse effect, even if there is also substantial evidence to the contrary. And under California law, what is substantial evidence in the context of CEQA? Well, expert testimony constitutes substantial evidence. And although we submitted expert testimony on the categories of land use and aesthetics, that expert testimony appears to have been completely ignored. It is also well settled under California law that non-expert testimony, observations, qualify under substantial evidence. So the public comment letters and the hearing comments on this matter are overflowing with non-expert personal observations as to parking, land use, aesthetics, mudslides, and the list goes on. Yet the staff has completely ignored this important body of substantial evidence. A case out of the First District of Appeals has held that statements of area residents who are not environmental experts may qualify as substantial evidence if they are based upon relevant personal observations or involve non-technical issue. The record is full, believe me, of our personal observations on non-technical matters. A case right out of Santa Barbara, and the Second District Court of Appeals has held that personal observations on non-technical issues can constitute substantial evidence. This case related to views, the case out of Santa Barbara that I'm speaking of also related to views and aesthetics. And this court specifically found that on issues of views and aesthetics, the observations and opinions of area residents can be the basis of substantial evidence. And then the Third District concluded that non-expert testimony offered at a public hearing where matters are within personal knowledge of the area's residents constitutes substantial evidence. Under California law, it is also well settled that any substantial negative effect of a project upon a view and other features of beauty can constitute significant environmental impact under CEQA. In the case at hand, we're looking at an extremely ambitious project that will affect view and other features of beauty. It's well documented, and you've heard over and over again that this project impacts one of only 2 pristine oak woodlands left standing in the entire city of Santa Barbara. We're not talking about a project that's slapped between the freeway and the railroad tracks. We are talking about a project that is surrounded by other open space that was dedicated by the developer of our neighborhood. We're talking about a project with public hiking trails through it and next to it. And we're talking about this a project that is trying to encroach upon and directly impact this pristine forest. The views across the forest and over to the mountains, as the prior photo up on the screen showed, is really pretty spectacular. And I'm suggesting that in the future that this is a spot where our school children will be brought to witness and experience the vanishing wonder of a pristine oak woodland. And yet here we're poised to possibly destroy that and to degrade it. And rather than allowing 10 homes and a parking lot to be built on the Rutherford parcel when current zoning only allows for 2 homes, an expanded EIR will compel the exploration of alternatives that don't destroy the views of and across this beautiful natural parcel. It feels really wrong that your prior comments and also our concerns have not been adequately addressed by staff, and that so much of the substantial evidence has been cast aside. It's a violation of CEQA, and it's a violation of California law. And I conclude my comments by asking staff to reconsider the comments and the evidence that's in the record and to expand the scope of the EIR accordingly as required by California law. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina Mcginnis is next. She has time donated by Sherry Berger and Brian Georgi. So 6 minutes. Ms. McGinnis, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Thompson and Commissioners. My name is Christina Mcginnis, and I'm here tonight on behalf of the Hidden Oaks Homeowners Association. And I have worked in Santa Barbara County as an environmental planner for almost 20 years, and just wanted to put that out there. And I have reviewed the prior ND as well as previous documentation that has been prepared for the CUP expansion for Valle Verde. I think really the larger question before your commission, even aside from what the focus of this EIR is you're looking at a conditional use that is allowed in a single-family residential neighborhood, and really the larger question is how much more do we want to allow a conditional use to expand, and what is the compatibility with the larger neighborhood? So just would like you to think about that as we're talking about these issues this evening. While I commend the city for opting to prepare an EIR on the project, the focused nature of this EIR should be expanded to include land use compatibility issues that would reduce identified policy and zoning inconsistencies of the project. The proposed focused EIR document would not fulfill CEQA requirements, as it would not address the critical land use portion of the environmental questionnaire as required by Appendix G of CEQA, a state requirement. This section is particularly important in relation to this project because it relates to the compatibility of the conditional use expansion in relation to the neighborhood. And I think the relevant question under that land use section of Appendix G would be, does the project conflict with any applicable land use plan, policy, or regulation of an agency with jurisdiction over the project, including but not limited to the general plan, specific plan, local coastal program, or zoning ordinance adopted for the purpose of avoiding or mitigating an environmental effect? And this question addresses several key issues with regard to the proposed expansion of this CUP in the Valle Verde project. I believe that the EIR scope should be revised to include a land use section because it's such a critical component of the analysis. And in particular, there are several existing city policies which were identified in a prior letter submitted on the negative declaration that was originally prepared for the project that would be in conflict. And I won't go into detail about what those are currently because of the limited time frame of public comment this evening, but we will be submitting those conflicting land use policies in a written correspondence to you before the end of public comment period. And zoning inconsistencies are also an issue and must be addressed. In the 1984 EIR, it was stated in the project description that the proposed expansion would be the final phase of development of existing Valle Verde lands that has been taking place over the past 17 years, and that's a quote. However, we are now faced with yet another expansion and proposed growth from this conditionally allowed use. At some point, the city's decision makers must recognize that allowing continued incremental growth of this use will cause irreconcilable neighborhood land use incompatibility. And it really has created a large-scale planning anomaly in this neighborhood, and expansion should be carefully considered. For example, the 1993 site changes that were described in the negative declaration that were allowed via substantial conformity determinations. They added bathrooms to existing units, converted existing units to other uses such as hospice, wellness clinic, and archives, and really most importantly converted 2 one-bedroom independent living units into 1 larger 2-bedroom units. The negative declaration stated that these incremental changes have not increased the density of the existing residential development. But I would like to point out that while the physical number of units may have decreased by combining some, the physical scale and massing of the project is just increasing as some of these units are getting larger and combining. So you might want to think about just the baseline number that's allowed via the original CUP and how some of these larger proposed uses are comparing to what was originally envisioned via that number. And the applicant must also apply for a zone change to make the zoning and land use designation consistent with the density of the proposed project. A key question in the land use section of Appendix G asks whether the project would result in inconsistency with the general plan or zoning ordinance. And as Heike mentioned, 10 units and 5 duplexes are proposed on the Rutherford property, which is currently zoned A1. And this proposed use is much denser than allowed under current zoning, therefore a zone change must be applied for. The original Santa Barbara City Planning Commission resolution for the Rutherford annexation notes that at full build-out potential, the annexation could result in 2 units. And additionally, while the number of persons who occupy senior housing, it's typically lower than for normal single-family residences, the proposed project's land use density must be consistent with the general plan designation for the site. Prior applications for increased density of the site above that allowed under existing zoning, such as a 1971 variance, required a zone change. And in fact, the variance that was granted under the 1971 permit was never built because it was contingent on the rezone. And a zone change is required to make the underlying applicable general plan and zoning designations consistent with proposed land use density. Other issues include policy inconsistencies with visual resources policy 2, which states that development on hillsides shall not significantly modify the natural topography and vegetation, and visual resources policy 2.1, which states that development which necessitates grading on hillsides with slopes greater than 30% should not be permitted. Grading, filling, and import of soil for the site would change the topography and visual character, particularly for the Rutherford property. We are asking that an EIR should be prepared, which does analyze alternatives to the project that are designed to minimize some of the identified impacts that we've brought up as part of scoping and also our prior comments on the ND, and to reduce visual impacts and inconsistency with policy. And just want to also state that the Hidden Oaks community is not by any means trying to stop this project. They're just hoping for an equitable and fair resolution to some of the land use issues that are of concern to them. So we're hoping that the community can work with Valverde to come to some agreement on some of the issues that are of concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Maida Palias, followed by Judy Arias.
Thank you for letting us speak tonight. I'm reading a letter that I wrote to the Planning Commission in March into the record. We're writing, I'm the president of the Hidden Valley Residents Association. We are writing to you regarding our concerns about the proposed Valverde expansion. I'm the president of the Hidden Valley Residents Association, representing 400 homes in Hidden Valley. Our understanding is that Valverde Retirement Home was licensed for a maximum of 350 residents and staff. Right now, if you count the actual bodies living at Valverde, the population count is almost 400 people. This does not include the 100-plus employees working at the facility. If 40 new units are approved, it appears that the resident count will grow by 80 to 480. Once you add the 100-plus employees, it appears that Valverde will have over 600 people at peak times. We believe this increased density negatively impacts this environmentally sensitive valley. We do not feel that the negative declaration prepared by the city adequately mitigates the impacts on parking, traffic, emergency access and egress, aesthetics, density, protecting the pristine oak woodland preserve, public views, landslides, and earthquake fault lines. We request that an environmental impact report be required for this project. We believe that the impact of this continued growth in population will negatively impact Hidden Valley with increased traffic speeding, increased parking shortages, as well as a public safety issue as 600-plus seniors try to evacuate Hidden Valley from Valverde in the case of an emergency. Remember, Hidden Valley is also home to Vista Del Monte Retirement Home, the Christian School, and a preschool at the Lutheran Church. And we really only have 2 points of ingress-egress on Modoc Road and one, on Torino through Veronica Springs, which is really a substandard county road. Additionally, there are many retirees living independently in the neighborhood's condos, duplexes, and single homes. Our neighborhood is simply not designed for high density. We have seen an increase in the number of small children in our neighborhood. The speeding down Torino and Palermo drives is a serious problem and needs to be addressed. Many Valverde residents like to walk in our area and do so on the street. Again, we do not want want to wait until there is a death or serious accident to have this problem addressed. I myself was leaving my home on Barcelona Drive a few weeks ago, and there was an elderly couple from Val Verde, and they were running, jogging, they're pretty active, on the street going against traffic. And I looked, correctly to get out, and all of a sudden I was turning into them. So it can be a dangerous area. Val Verde is becoming more and more a commercial operation that exists deep inside a residential zone. The addition of a bank, beauty salon, coffee shop, business offices, and fine dining are new commercial enterprises. These will bring in more traffic into Hidden Valley. We understand that Val Verde currently conducts dinners for local organizations. We see this as yet another commercial aspect to Val Verde. The proposed 40 units will remove a large segment of open space. When Val Verde was first built, the density was in line with the surrounding neighborhood at 4 homes per acre. We are concerned that the 40 proposed units will increase density to an undesirable level and have a negative impact on the surrounding neighborhood by creating a precedent for increased density. Many of the residents picked Val Verde for the open space feel, and the additional units will affect this atmosphere. Some of our street counts indicate that almost 100 plus cars on Calle de los Amigos during the daytime. The parking study conducted by ATS is faulty and needs to be conducted again. There needs to be enough employee parking to handle the demands of the employees. We have pictures of double parking on Calle de los Amigos opposite the main Val Verde buildings. We believe that at least 109 employee spots need to be included in this plan before any additional development should be allowed to occur. Based on the current negative declaration, this is environmentally sensitive issue has not been mitigated sufficiently. We were told that initially the project would be all single-story units. However, lately we have been told that the new administration building will have 2 stories. Is this correct? Will this project complete the build-out of the site? We believe the build-out was supposed to be complete in 1986. We have concerns that the dust, noise, and traffic from the construction. Where will the construction workers park, as Calle de los Amigos is parked solid with current employee cars? We're also concerned about the construction schedule. Noise echoes through the valley. In fact, when the wind's blowing right, we can hear Earl Warren Showgrounds at the very end of the valley. We would like construction to be limited to 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. We would like to have a residents committee involved in these issues if the project is approved. Our board remains concerned about the public safety issue. We are located in a valley, and the only way out is Modoc Road. This road becomes a major traffic route during times of emergency or blockage on Highway 101. Being able to make a left-hand turn is very difficult. For the safety of all Hidden Valley residents, we feel that a signal at Calle de los Amigos and Modoc Road is necessary. There have been many accidents at this corner and many near misses. Unfortunately, the city seems to wait until there's a death before acting. We would like to request your help in supporting a traffic light option. The signal at Las Positas and Modoc, service level D, is documented to already be under capacity for current needs, V/C 0.79, and this is before any more units get built. We do not feel that the negative declaration adequately examines the traffic problems in this valley. The negative declaration does not adequately classify or mitigate these significant issues. Stating that the additional vehicle trips will not impact long-term traffic is false. We request an EIR report be prepared on this issue. Additionally, we take exception to limiting the focus EIR to long-term trips. Whether short or long-term trips, we still have those vehicles driving down the streets of Hidden Valley, and they will have an impact on traffic issues in Hidden Valley. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy Arias, followed by Louise Carey.
I'm Judy Arias, and I'm here speaking as president of the Allied Neighborhood Association Board of Directors, and we wish you to require a full and complete EIR on this project. Many of the items that Meta Palias has mentioned are items that Allied is also concerned about. For instance, we're concerned that the proposed commercials should be used in light of the conditional use permit which Val Verde has operated on. The traffic impacts, be it long trips or short trips, they're still coming through the neighborhood. They're going by at 45 miles an hour. We have a park that caters especially to small children. You have a photograph showing some of the parking of the parents taking their children. It's an accident waiting to happen. The speeding on our streets is a major concern. That is also at Cali de los Amigos as well as on Palermo and Torino Drive. There should be, I understand that bumps are not desired by the fire department, and I understand that because Val Verde has emergency equipment in approximately once every week. But there are tables that can be put that will slow down the traffic. We're seeing a lot more families in Hidden Valley with small children, and there is a serious problem. I'm glad to see that there's additional parking proposed, but I would like to make sure that the calculated amount of parking for staff, guests, proposed new residents, and any events that they're having will be carried and not be on the street. With the one fire that we had recently, the fire truck and the parking on each side of the street blocked Cali de los Amigos, which is a main exit. If there had been a wind and the fire had taken off, we would have been in serious trouble. Again, Maida spoke about the ability to exit our area. It's almost impossible with the last fire. You could not make a left turn on Modoc Road. With the Painted Cave fire, my house was in 20 minutes of burning. You could not get out of our area. My house, in the 45 years I've lived there, has nearly burned 3 times. And it's not a pleasant experience, I can guarantee you. Mrs. Lodge knows that too. So we are in a high fire hazard area. We have Vista Del Monte, we have Hidden Valley Verde residents, we have people who are in the hospitals in these facilities, and they all need to get out. And it needs to be looked at very carefully, the traffic impacts and the ability to exit. The Riviera has only 2 routes down, and that shows a lot of the problems when you have fire. Let's not repeat the same thing here. The loss of open space should be addressed. You have photographs which show the mustard plant on the hillsides. Those are the plants that revegetate during the first part after the soil has been disturbed. And you can see the streaks of yellow and know that that is one of the most unstable hillsides in the Santa Barbara County, according to Ray Kudre. And any type of construction or movement of soil needs to be looked at very carefully. So there needs to be a soil study done. Also of concern is the noise and the demolition and the construction problems. This is construction that's going to go on for well over a year, and it's going to have a lot of impacts. I can tell you stories that we can hear the Earl Warren Showgrounds from our house. We can hear any events in Val Verde. It's like a bowl, and there is a big problem with noise impact during construction, and that should be looked at and evaluated in the EIR. Finally, I would like to urge you to look at the noise, the hazards of the soil instability, and the transportation and traffic through our area. We would like to work with Val Verde. We'd like to be good neighbors, but we have to see that some of the things are slowed down in our area. We're not a throughway to their business. Thank you.
Thank you. Louise Carey, followed by Robert Bugler.
My name is Louise Carey. I have been a resident of Valle Verde now for 16 years. I've also been on the Master Plan Committee since the beginning, and with Bill Spangler, he and I are chair of the Disaster Committee for Valle Verde, the Resident Disaster Network. I have to say that I have been really impressed with the administration of Valle Verde and the ongoing plans, the concern for preserving the woodland and preserving the beauty of the sites and making the smallest possible environmental dent in this expansion. Also, when the population of Valle Verde is now significantly less than it was when I arrived. And with this new building, the number of people will be approximately what it was when we came. And all I can say is you don't notice the difference. There's not a significant difference in the traffic or in the number of people walking around the halls at Valle Verde. With regard to the oak woodland, I'm particularly fond of that, and am concerned about the fire impact And I think the present plan has made a good compromise between trying to increase fire-safe planting and maintaining the distance necessary to preserve the buildings at Valle Verde in the event of a fire. Also, the proposed inlet on the Rutherford property will be needed for evacuation. The fire people talk to us, and they talk about sheltering in place. And as you know, in the last fire, the Jesucita fire, Valle Verde was a major home for refugees from Wood Glen Hall and senior living concepts and other facilities in town. I would like to mention that I have not seen deer, but have seen in front, right near our house, all of the other species mentioned by Lawrence Hunt, the biologist. And I'm very happy with the way that the program, the present design has turned out. It's far superior to earlier versions, and I hope that one day it might be built.
Thank you. Robert Bugler, followed by Henry Jones.
I'm Robert Bugler, a resident in independent living of Valle Verde. And my wife and I have been at Valle Verde for a little over 3 years at this point. And I have an engineering background and kind of an analytical mind in some ways. I'm not a traffic expert, but I want to address the traffic question. During our 3 years in residence, I've had an opportunity to experience driving in local traffic at different times of the day, different days of the week, while on shopping errands, keeping medical appointments, visiting church, that kind of thing. From a traffic standpoint, our driving is typical of those other Valle Verde residents, independent living, most occurring at non-peak times. Looking at the population that we have to deal with, compared to the early history of Valle Verde and looking on into the future, we have been going through an evolution of our housing plan just to keep pace with the desires of the current retiring community and that sort of thing. And what we've been doing is we've been converting single, small bedroom units, sometimes two at a time, into two-bedroom units. And these two-bedroom units are often occupied by just one resident. And what we've seen is that over a period of time, we've seen a reduction in the number of people in independent living. This isn't counting the hospital facility or the health center, and the other things for for the assisted living. But just in independent living, we've actually had a reduction from earlier years of what our total head count is. And then another thing to look at is this. Over these same years, we've had a tremendous improvement in medical care for the aged and the seniors, and a greater life expectancy. And we can see that we have a number of residents in our community who are over 100 years old at this point. You know what that means in terms of traffic? It says that with the average age of our residents increasing, we have less and less of our independent living members driving cars. They're no longer capable of driving cars. They have to rely on our common transportation facilities, which are quite adequate to take people to doctor's appointments, shopping errands, and that sort of thing. And so what we see is actually over a period of time, as we become an older average age population, we're actually impacting traffic in the area less than we did maybe 20 years ago. Taking a look at another component of the traffic, the impact of our staff coming to and from work. For the most part, staff do not arrive and depart during busy commute hours. The maintenance staff generally arrive to start work by 7 a.m., and they depart between 3 and 4. These are non-peak driving times. The dining room staff, except for the kitchen, need to be there by mid-morning for the noon meal, and again in late afternoon for dinner, and they leave late after dinner, 7 to 8 o'clock. They're not contributing to peak traffic either. The health center runs a 3-shift operation, round the clock, 24/7. And except for a shift change at 7 o'clock in the morning, they don't contribute to peak hour traffic. And that shift change is just a handful of people, really, at that 7 o'clock hour. The ones who have to be there by 7 aren't contributing to traffic. The ones who are leaving probably do. For over 40 years, Valley Verde has operated in Hidden Valley as a good neighbor to the surrounding community, with a minimum of traffic impact on our immediate neighbors and to the Santa Barbara community as a whole. One area over which we have no control is the impact of emergency vehicle traffic. That traffic is not quite the same that you would see in a facility such as ours that might be a hospital with emergency vehicles coming and going all the time. They come and they go as required. And the very interesting thing about it is they don't really disturb the community very much because they don't use their emergency sirens as they're approaching. It's disquieting to the people who live at Valley Verde and kind of disquieting to people who live in the neighborhood too. So there's little we can do about that kind of a thing because that just happens. Anyway, getting on to my closing point, Valley Verde's master plan for the addition of 40 residence units, in my mind as an engineer looking at a project of the size that we have, bringing the total residences to 254. That's the upper limit of our expansion plans as far as I know. It amounts to less than a 20% expansion of our existing facilities. The traffic impact of the few additional staff required to serve the new residents will have a negligible impact, and mostly from a few additions of the staff that might occur during peak times. Above that, there should be no significant impact to traffic with this plan that we have. As one of our earlier commenters said, bringing these new residents in will bring us up to a level that we were at some earlier point. And for all practical purposes, the overall impact should be minimal in terms of impacting the existing infrastructure of the city in terms of traffic interchanges such as at Las Positos and the highway, that sort of thing. We shouldn't even impact it a bit. So that's the extent of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Henry Jones, followed by Donald O'Dowd.
I'm Henry Jones. I've been a resident of Valla Verde for about 11 and a half years. I've been on the Master Plan Committee since its inception 6 years ago. I'm also a member of the Valla Verde Resident Council, or I have a series of comments to make. I'd like to emphasize what's already been mentioned, that the entire plan site is not in its natural state. It's a pre-disturbed area and has been since the 1800s when it was an orchard. The biologist study concluded that the proposed vegetation management plan will result in fewer and less intense impacts to native vegetation than the present modification practices. The proposed plan will improve habitat conditions for plants and wildlife. These are almost direct quotes from the biologist. Statements have been made regarding possible disruption of a vital wild animal trail. This trail on the Rutherford plot did not exist before I cut it through the dense and widespread poison oak 11 years ago. Lately, when I've been temporarily unable to use this path it's become so overgrown as to almost disappear because the wild animals decided they'd take another route. Doesn't seem to be that necessary. There have been, during the last meeting, there have been some objections to the location of the proposed staff parking area. I want everyone to be clear that that has been moved from the north end of the project to this position over the existing administration building, which was shown earlier in this session. There's no longer any idea that it's going to be anywhere near the north end of the property. Regarding parking at the front entrance to the administration building, I have a couple of comments. Times have changed since our primary entrance with 8 steps was built in the 1960s. How many curbs, cut curbs, ADA ramps, and disabled parking slots did Santa Barbara have in, say, 1965? The ADA didn't even exist then. It's time that Valle Verde has had an ADA-approved entrance. Why not? Our neighbors have complained about the closing of the polling place, a Valle Verde service to the community on our campus. It was closed for lack of ADA access because of these steps. This proposed regrading that's in the master plan will permit us once again to have a voting station. The proposed project does not, this has been mentioned before, but I want to reinforce it. The proposed project does not exceed the original conditional use permit of 1984, which approved the 254 independent living units. Rather, the plan reflects the demand by incoming residents for larger apartments and more amenities. This has been an enormous trend in the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, many apartments have been combined to try to satisfy this and enlarged, resulting in 2 residents occupying the space for nearly 4. And many of our apartments, as was mentioned a moment ago, have but 1 person in them. I don't know what that percentage is, but it's a significant percentage. So you can't take the number of apartments and multiply by 2 and get the total number of residents by a long shot. Thus, the proposed project entails the return of this campus to no more than 254 apartments and does not pose, therefore, a significant increase in traffic, noise, deliveries, or other similar disturbances from those levels common a decade ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Donald O'Dowd, followed by Norman Boyan.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, I'm Donald O'Dowd. I'm President of the Resident Council at Valle Verde. I am also a member of the elderly couple who was referred to just a little while ago. We were running against traffic because that's what joggers are supposed to do. When we came to the Barcelona turn, the driver of the car did not look to her right. She looked to her left. We assumed that she would look to her right, and we were mistaken in that respect. But after running that route 800 times, that is the single instance that we have had over 4 years of coming anywhere near being hit by a vehicle. So I confess to being the elderly jogger. My wife was the other elderly jogger. I wanted to comment on parking and traffic particularly. In earlier testimony, the people from Hidden Oaks have commented that the traffic congestion at Valle Verde causes them some problems, and they fear that they might have trouble exiting Hidden Oaks, which after all is in the midst of an oak forest, and therefore is vulnerable to fire and I suppose other things like earthquakes. They would exit, I assume, on Torino Road, and Valle Verde people do not park on Torino. There are roughly 3 cars in about 150, 200 yards on a normal day, and there are often 2 cars from Hidden Oaks parking on Torino as well. If you were to turn onto Calle de los Amigos, that is a problem. There are cars on both sides. It's narrower than Torino Road, and it is difficult for residents as well as any other people in the neighborhood. Though we are at the end of the road, remember, so much more affected by it than anyone else. When the new parking structure is constructed up on behind the maintenance building, which will have 60-some spaces, the employees who are all of the people who park on that street are employees. Residents don't park there, and visitors usually can find space on the campus. These employees will be required to move onto the on-campus parking lot, and that should leave that road almost completely unused for parking during the day, and except for community people who can park there if they wish. The parking that we get on Torino now, incidentally, is for residents of the community using the Hidden Valley Park. And that gets fairly busy at times. It is not Viverde people. The new parking area for employees, some people have said that they won't use it because it's inconvenient. I walk the route every day. It's between 1 and 3 minutes from any place on the campus where an employee goes to carry out his or her regular duties, except for people in maintenance who cover the whole campus, of course, from their base of operations 10 seconds from the parking lot. The traffic burden has been a concern, and it will come up in the focused EIR. And the comments that have been made on employee shifts and how these pretty much do not impact the peak hour traffic in the neighborhood. Our residents do not drive much in peak hours if they can avoid it, as Mr. Bugler pointed out before. Indeed, our residents don't drive all that much. The suggestion was that about 100 additional daily trips would be made for the new people. My wife and I are very active in the community in a number of organizations. We have 1 car, not 2, and any given week, on a couple of days, our car does not leave its parking space. And we're active. I look at my neighbors' cars, and many days they don't move. Sometimes they don't move for a week at a time. Although people have cars, they're older, they use public transportation, and they don't really clog up the roads, and they do not speed. Let me tell you, I follow my colleagues out of the campus, and they don't speed. They go too slow for me, but I've learned to be patient, and I put up with that. One other comment, and then I'll complete my remarks. The wildlife corridor issue has come up at several of the hearings to which I have come. And it interests me, if you look at the terrain, the wildlife corridor probably went right through the living room and the kitchen of people living in Hidden Oaks until they built their houses, I think after 1982, across the wildlife corridor. So the wildlife has had to move its pattern a little bit to the east in order to get around those homes that was built across it. And now there's a proposed 126-foot wide corridor between Hidden Oaks and the first building on Viverde. I would think those displaced wildlife could probably find their way through that corridor because you have to give them credit. They know how to get around the territory. Well, thank you very much. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Norman Boyan, followed by Ruth Georgi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. I think my green slip indicates I'm speaking for 11 people.
We hope that you don't have to.
That would ordinarily allow me 22 minutes plus my own 2. However, I'm thinking about how long you've been here today, and I will promise you I will go nowhere near that amount of time.
And we have your written comments, which will be made part of the record.
Right. My name is Norman Bowen. I'm a 40-year resident of Santa Barbara as of July 1 and an 8-year resident of Valley Verde. I have served both as Vice President and President of the Valley Verde Resident Council Board. My support for the master plan expansion, which the Commission has under consideration, is clear and unequivocal. Today, I represent not only myself, but also 11 other Valley Verde residents, which is almost as many as people live up in Hidden Oaks, who respectfully petition you to allow me to use their time allocation, only a fraction of which I will actually use. After noting that the proposed project in no way compromises the public view, I'm not talking about private use, but I'm talking about the public view. No way compromises the public view in and around the property. I will describe our green initiative briefly and then turn to an environmental domain which typically receives much less attention, namely the public good. Valley Verde has become a state and national leader in the green initiatives in its remodeling of existing units and features green building in the 40 units which are proposed. Our green focus goes beyond the physical environment per se to include a weekly farmers market for the sale of locally and regionally grown produce and serious attention to waste detail. In addition, Valley Verde has added solar panels in sufficient quantity across the campus to reduce significantly its demand on the electrical grid and has saved more than $170,000 in expenses over the last 2-3 years. Recognition of the green movement has brought no less than 5 national, state, and local awards to Valley Verde. Now let me turn to the reasons why we believe Valley Verde's longtime contribution to the public good is a valid claim of a desirable environmental impact. First, Valley Verde has deservedly earned the reputation in local politics of being a significant part of our precincts being the highest percentage voting precinct in the city. With respect to city elections, Valley Verde has regularly invited candidates for office to come before its residents to make their cases for election. For many years, Valley Verde served as a polling place, and Harry Jones has already explained to you why we are no longer serving as a polling place, but that our plan will permit us to return to the kind of facility which will allow us to get back in there if the Election Commission so desires. During the recent fire, Valley Verde opened its doors to a number of residents of Wood Glen Hall, also to folks from Villa Alomar, and served as a transfer location for some 120 other senior residents. Beyond this emergency response, Valley Verde regularly admits a number of Santa Barbara residents to its health center without the need to pay an entry fee as required of Valley Verde residents. Valley Verde is home to a number of educational offerings open to the entire community. These come from Santa Barbara City College, Vistas, UCSB, Music Academy of the West. We're not only a center of civic responsibility, but we're also a center of high-quality cultural activity. Third, residents of Valley Verde provide extensive volunteer service in the Santa Barbara community. Last year, our residents donated over 6,000 hours of service to Cottage Hospital, the Braille Institute, government agencies, environmental groups, Lotus Land, hospice, museums, public libraries, religious organizations, and service groups. To sum up, we will continue to add positively to the environment conventionally considered and we have contributed and will continue to contribute significantly to civic benefits, cultural affairs, and volunteerism. Our expansion will offer to 40 additional senior couples and singles a place which will benefit not only them, but afford a place in a culture of civic benefit and service, which is a hallmark of our community. We consider what our community is doing to be a significantly positive contribution to the public good and to the larger environment of our city. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ruth Georgi, and Ruth is the last speaker unless there's someone else who didn't turn in a slip.
Good evening. My name is Ruth Georgi, and I'm a resident of Hidden Oaks Estates. And I've been in front of you several times in the past. I'm starting to feel like Bill Murray, and this is my Groundhog Day. I'd like to first address some of the comments that I've heard, and then I will go on with a little bit of a prepared statement. This CUP that Val Verde is operating under is currently out of compliance in so many directions. The number of staff and residents was provided by Val Verde itself. It's not some numbers that we have made up. It was provided by Val Verde. As far as the public view versus private, the photo that Ms. Killian showed you was from the public street, Torino. It is not on our property of Hidden Oaks Estates. And regarding the wildlife trail, perhaps it was in a different location prior to the building of our properties. I don't know. I am the second or third owner of my home, so I don't know what was there before. But I did receive a phone call or some communication from a Val Verde resident of 20 plus years who told me that the wildlife trail was there when she moved in to Val Verde 20 plus years ago. So when I left this room on March 5th, 2009, I thought it was very clear that 4 out of the 5 commissioners wanted to see a complete EIR conducted on the project before you. City staff has made the decision that a limited or focused EIR is sufficient. I could not disagree more. This is a very large and ambitious plan. Past expansions have required an EIR and were not as large, nor did they propose building on the natural slope of this property's edges and into part of the pristine oak woodland, which after 25 years, Val Verde has yet to dedicate. Minutes from the last meeting include Commissioner White stating that parking is not working, would like further analysis of the parking. Commissioner Thompson would like to see phasing plan for the construction. Commissioner Bartlett is environmentally superior site. Planning effort is needed. Parking impacts have not adequately been addressed and wants to be able to weigh alternatives. Overall, the consensus of the Commission, and I am quoting from page 9 of the minutes from this last meeting, the consensus of the Commission wanted to see an EIR conducted due to the project's significance. Concentrating on the number of units proposed for this property does not take into account the entire scope. The large addition into the administration building, the maintenance building, and parking, which is adding additional hardscape. Again, there is a definite loss of open space and green that is not being adequately addressed. It needs to be addressed. I have submitted a letter dated May 28, 2009 that outlines my reasoning for a complete EIR. A complete EIR will give comments and suggestions and suggest solutions to parking, drainage, traffic, sewage, waste, and biological issues which have been a concern since this project was first introduced in 2006. It would also address the scope and staging that is of great concern to myself and my neighbors. Please require a complete EIR on all aspects of this project. To do less would not serve this board nor the community, especially the Hidden Valley neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll also mention that we received a written correspondence from William Spangler, which will be entered into the record along with the other correspondence that was received in the previous period. And before we're finished, staff will put back up the contact information on the screen for anyone who wants to submit any subsequent written correspondence regarding the EIR. Now, for the commission, do we have any discussion from any of the commissioners? Nobody? Okay. Commissioner Lodge.
Mr. Lawson, could we see the list of the different elements, possible elements of an EIR? I think there were, yes.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Lodge, this list is just showing what we found wasn't going to be scoped in. So in other words, we looked at this and found that either through mitigations or the impacts were less than significant. There was no need to go further in our analysis for EIR, these items.
Right. Well, that's why I wanted to see it again.
Right.
Chairman Thompson, Commissioner Lodge, I also wanted to add that all our EIRs do have a section on land use, and we will discuss zoning, but it's not an impact analysis section. The consequences of land use will be addressed in the appropriate section where, for example, traffic, biology.
All right. I did have a question about what several speakers have mentioned, evacuation in case of a fire. And there are just the two routes. My own experience with having been evacuated both for the Jesucita and the T fires, there are two routes out for me from the Riviera. Only one of them. If I wanted to drive toward the fire, I could have used it, but I didn't want to drive toward the fire. And some situation like that could occur in Hidden Valley as well. And is this something that is going to be looked at when you're looking at transportation, vehicle trips? It doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be something under which you would be looking at that. And it seems to me it's something that an EIR should examine.
Chairman Thompson, Commissioner Lodge, we were not planning on looking at emergency evacuation any more than had been addressed already. We had got the input from the wildland fire specialist in the fire department, and she indicated to us that she felt that we were adequate as we were. But we could add it to the EIR.
And Commissioner Lodge, as part of the licensing for Valle Verde, they do have to go through emergency evacuation plans. So, as I understand it, about twice a year they go through a evacuation plan. As pointed out, they do have buses and other types of vehicles to transport bigger numbers off-site. So they do have to do that as part of their licensing.
I'm aware of that, and I believe it's even more often than twice a year. But even so, in an emergency, things may not always turn out the way that you think they were going to. Another question.
Lodge, one other thought is that all these developments are pretty much, this project and a couple other developments are pretty much at the end of the development. There is not a huge volume of development that needs to use the exit routes to exit this area. So I'm sure that was a consideration included by the department.
I'm sorry. You mean the additional
there
trips?
There isn't a huge amount of urban development that has to exit using the road system. There's just Hidden Valley, there's the Valle Verde, there are a couple other smaller projects in the area. It's not like the Mission Canyon, where there's tons of development further back into the canyon that also has to find its way out of the canyon.
On the another question, if I may, on the site visit, I noticed, and I'm looking at the plans, as I recall, most of the parking for the residents is in little parking lots. And when people are backing up, they're backing up into the parking lot and then exiting. In the new plan, the parking all seems to be arranged so that they would be backing up into traffic lanes, and that is of concern to me. I don't know if that is something that has been considered. It wouldn't be, vehicle trips would not include that.
Hi, Chair Thompson and Commissioner Lodge. I'm Stacy Wilson with the Transportation Division. We did take a look at the configuration of the parking, and that which you are describing is, I would call, the diagonal on-street parking. There were a lot of considerations that went into that style of parking. Principally, it's a situation of we could have had the style of parking that is there now. That does take up more space. As the applicants brought forward the other diagonal parking, the on-street parking, as a means of reducing the amount of paving. And due to the low volumes and low speeds, we think that the parking will work. And it has been reviewed by our traffic engineer as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The initial study for me, the revised initial study raises a number of questions that I would like to at the very least get some feedback on tonight. And I ask these questions with the intent of using this process to focus the analysis in the EIR to generate function to the process so that we get our questions answered as opposed to collecting information. And I know that an EIR is supposed to be an information tool for the Commission, but I look at this document as being a very important piece that we need to use as commissioners and the public and the applicant to evaluate the environmental effects of the project and, as a number of speakers have suggested, the land use compatibility. And I know that sometimes the city doesn't go into land use compatibility as deeply as it should, but I recall projects where issues related to conditional use permits and zoning performance and this and that are laid out, and it's very helpful to decision makers to have that information early on so we can come to a crisp decision when the project is in fact in front of us. The first question I had is, how will the city resolve the difference of opinion regarding the wildlife impacts? We got two different experts, Mr. Troutwine and the applicant's biologist, saying there will or will not be impacts with regard to sensitive species, what have you. How's the city going to resolve that? Are you going to have a peer review process? Are you going to do a supplemental analysis? What's going to be the answer to the question, who's right? Or is that the right question to ask? And if not, what is the right question to ask as far as biology?
Commissioner Justice, we are going to hire a consultant to do a peer review of the existing biological report in addition to the traffic study, and to prepare an environmental impact report to document the different opinions and to come to a conclusion on what their opinion is, and then we will present that to the public and the Commission, and we may well end up with a difference of opinion. It is not uncommon in an environmental document.
Okay. Very good. Because there is some question on the part of the public regarding what's significant and what should or should not be in the EIR, is it fair to assume that the EIR will have a summary of the reasoning in the initial study, or in the document itself that says why particular impacts are not significant and therefore not evaluated in the EIR. The tendency I hear is for folks to want a full EIR, but we've got a state law that says that the EIR looks at significant impacts and requires mitigations and alternatives to focus just on those significant impacts. Is that the direction we're going, or do we
Correct.
have a broader focus here?
Mr. Justice, we are narrowing the focus. We will have a summary of what's in the initial study. The initial study will be attached to the EIR as well.
Great.
Mitigation measures in the initial study will be brought forward and included in the mitigation monitoring and reporting program.
Great. And we'll have thresholds.
And the
They'll be
EIR
used in
will
that
have
whole process,
thresholds
so we'll
just
get
as...
the whole piece of cake there.
Correct.
Great. How will alternatives be addressed? Do you have some ideas in mind, or are they just going to focus on unavoidable biological or unavoidable traffic impacts? How does that kind of play out in this one?
We will develop a range of alternatives to develop potentially significant impacts identified in the environmental document.
Great.
And we will compare those alternatives and recommend the environmentally preferred alternative.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. Commissioner Bartlett, do you have any inputs?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on what Commissioner Jostes was talking about, I had brought up the notion of alternatives at our last meeting, and something that I would like to see addressed as this gets analyzed is, what are the options to not just having more square footage per person or per resident in this project? Because what's happened is we've eliminated kitchens even, and now we have to add buildings to get back to the same number of units. So even though we have no more people, we have a lot more built environment, less open space, which then has impacts on, wildlife and everything else. So are there alternatives to just building larger and larger units, even though we don't have any increased population occurring? So obviously maybe that's an advantage for traffic, but the more spread out development in itself kind of goes against the whole green philosophy that this project is trying to put forward. So we're building bigger and bigger units for the same number of people. So I'd like to somehow see an alternative that addresses that in the options that are being studied. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Okay, there is no formal action to be taken on this at this meeting. I think we have a lot of input for staff as to the scope of the EIR. And Mr. Lawson, you could put up again the contact information if people want to submit subsequent written comments. And before we close out this item, Mr. Cato, is there anything else that staff needs?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We do have other business to continue on, so I would ask you to, if you're going to carry on conversations, to take it out in the hall. You're welcome to stay, but keep it quiet, please. Okay, the next item is a review of the proposed zoning ordinance amendment to extend Measure E. Mr. Cato?
Ms. Weiss will be giving this presentation, but we'll how about a minute to let the room clear out?
Now's your chance, John.
Good evening, Chair Thompson and Planning Commissioners. I'm Betty Weiss, the City Planner, for a brief presentation of your last item on today's agenda.
Very brief, we hope.
Yes. A written report was prepared and included in your packet, which I think thoroughly explained the matter before you, which is a proposed zoning ordinance amendment related to the processing of non-residential development projects. There is a specific section within the city's municipal code and the zoning ordinance that deals with the processing standards and findings and so forth for non-residential development projects. And this ordinance is very important as it is tied to the city's growth management program, which was instituted with a charter amendment in November of 1989. The citizens passed Measure E, which established significant parameters for the city's growth management for a 20-year period. And again, I know you all are very familiar with Measure E that is included in the city's charter, Section 1508. Also, around the same time, the city was undertaking a general plan update, which looked at a number of major land use considerations, circulation, housing, as well as resource impact concerns that are referenced in the charter section, the general plan, and this ordinance that implements both of those important policy documents. So we have been undertaking the Plan Santa Barbara general plan update process, and I believe you've heard probably more than once when a question was asked, well, what about the expiration of Measure E? And we all have been aware that the charter section 1508 by its own language does expire in December of this year, or January 1st, 2010. So it was our understanding that the zoning ordinance would just prevail and continue the operation or implementation with no change. And that's what this amendment will indeed make clear, that the zoning ordinance program to implement the growth management of a 3 million square foot overall development cap would remain for a remaining period of time to complete Plan Santa Barbara and end up with whatever implementing ordinances the City Council wants to adopt. Our experience the last time, about 19 years ago, was that the City Council did adopt some interim ordinances more quickly once the policy direction was clear, and then this major update to the zoning ordinance was adopted shortly thereafter. So we do expect that after the City Council makes major policy decisions regarding Plan Santa Barbara, there could be some more immediate new ordinances to go into effect that would, in effect, amend this ordinance. But our recommendation is to extend it by amending 3 statements, 3 dates that occur in the section. So the City Attorney's Office has carefully reviewed the ordinance, and we've provided attached to your report a draft showing the amendment and 3 specific places changing the year January 1st, the date January 1st, 2010 to January 1st, 2015. And then we also talked in the report about one other important Measure E matter that we feel needs to be adjusted in order to move forward in these next coming years, and that's how to restock the small addition category. I'm certainly available to explain in any detail if you needed more explanation, but we did provide you the resolution, which has been amended over time to help implement Measure E and the zoning ordinance section. As over this 20-year period, there have been changes to the program overall, and one important change was the creation of the economic development category, and that's where we look to pull back some small addition square footage to hold us over in these next few years. So that's explained in your staff report as well. This matter has been before the Ordinance Committee, and they held a good discussion and wanted to be clear about how this proposed amendment doesn't change the overall 3 million square foot cap. What we've heard so far from members of the public is they understand this. Again, I think people have been somewhat expecting that the program would stay status quo for the next couple of years until we complete Plan Santa Barbara. But there are members of the community that are concerned about various elements of the Plan Santa Barbara process, and even, just what have we learned from Measure E, and is it okay to just go ahead and continue to do the program as we have it? And there was a question about the TEDR, and I mentioned that in the staff report too. I wanted to let you know that at the Ordinance Committee, a few members of the public questioned, how does the transfer of existing development rights ordinance fit into this this particular situation. And both the city attorney and I explained that it's a separate ordinance. It certainly was adopted by the council to be compatible with the Measure E program and this development plan ordinance. In fact, in order to do a TEDR, you also have to process 2 development plan approvals, one for your sending site, one for your receiving site. Paul Casey and I recently, just this week on Monday, were at the Citizens Planning Association, their land use committee meeting, and we were talking with them more as well about the TEDR program. But we understand, based on the comments we heard at the Ordinance Committee, that they supported this particular extension. And I hope we've answered some of their questions on the related but different TEDR program. So with that, staff's recommendation for you this evening is to consider this amendment. We did notice it for a public hearing, and I really haven't had much contact from the public. One phone call from the Board of Realtors, and then the 2 letters that we have here. Actually, the grand jury was a little bit interested in this too, but not a lot of public comment. But so I don't think tonight we'll have much. But we're interested in your comments and recommend a recommendation to the City Council to move forward with the introduction and adoption of this amendment. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question. First, I'll say that I'm a little disappointed we weren't able to get the general plan update enacted before the expiration of Measure E so that we wouldn't have to do this. But is the date 2015 an indicator of how long you're predicting it's going to take us to get through the general plan update process?
I don't think it'll take that long. As I said, I think that there could be new interim or ordinances or amendments to this much sooner than that. We just wanted to pick a period of time so it wouldn't have to be amended again. For example, 2 years was one consideration, but that's certainly open for your... My estimation is that sometime next year, the City Council will provide... we will provide the council with a certified document, which this commission would review and certify the EIR, and that by sometime early next year, you will as well be formulating your recommendations for council action on the land use element, the housing element, and at least the beginnings of what we think perhaps an interim ordinance or a long-term ordinance structure would entail. But that could take several more months, up to another year, to work through an ordinance process. So I think at a minimum it's 2 years. I really can't actually imagine that it would be 5 years. I think that would be too long. But we picked the longer period of time just because we wanted to allow that we wouldn't have to amend it again.
Okay. Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This seems pretty simple and straightforward, and yes, we could go back and forth on just how many years, but it seems to me reasonable to go to 2015, and I think we should proceed with this amendment and hope that we do indeed complete the general plan update before then.
Commissioner Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Commission over the past 6 or 7 months has had a fairly robust discussion about the importance of considering jobs housing issues. And before we went to Council with a recommendation on the policy preferences report, we also struggled with the non-residential numbers. And we recommended, I think, as a full commission, that we go forward with lower numbers for the reasons that many of us felt continuing the status quo just was not going in the right direction. And given that we have neither Ms. Jacobs, Ms. Larson, or Mr. White in the chambers tonight to talk about it, at this point in time, unless we were to be able to reflect our preferences that we had articulated before in reduced numbers for the non-residential, I'm not prepared to support this. And I think we might be able to work something out if we could have a full discussion with the full commission, but I just can't go there right now. And I know what staff is thinking, and I appreciate your perspective on trying to get this moving forward, but we knew this was going to happen, and I don't think this is going in the right direction.
Chair Thompson, may I just make one reply to that? I think it's really a little bit early to say that what the new program really will be. I know the Planning Commission, I was here with all of your deliberations on the numbers and the important policy direction in the living within resources priority for affordable housing and so forth. But we really do have a ways to go before we see what will be the ultimate trade-off questions with more information than we now know about how do we want to move forward with a reasonable amount of, with the appropriate amounts of non-residential growth to go along with residential growth into the future. And I would just be, I understand the recommendations that we had from the Planning Commission, but those were really for additional study at this point. I just think reflecting back on what the jobs, housing, and policy basis was for Measure E was to continue to encourage the residential development. I mean, there's two parts of this equation. So looking only at this part of it, the non-residential part, and trying to recraft it for something of the future right now, I understand the desire to do so, but I do think that that's a difficult challenge. And, you know, we come to you every year with the reports of what's going on with this square footage. We have the allocation process. And so I'm curious if you want to expand, if you think the extent of this discussion with the full commission or with the staff, I mean, how much information would we be looking at possibly revising, or it's just somehow cutting the number down? I'm not sure where this might lead. I'd like some idea about that.
Mr. Chair, you make a good point. My preference would be to cut the number down for an interim period of time until we have the general plan update in place. I think there needs to be incentives for the process to work and to work in a timely manner. And I'd be willing to attend any special meetings that were necessary at any point I possibly could, so that this doesn't get delayed any farther, because I know time is critical here. But I think just going back over the tape of the discussion that we had when we met in the David Gebhard room and that follow-up hearing could be better reflected in the numbers that we're going forward with on an interim basis.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we were pretty close still to the 1.5 remaining, but I could look at that more closely. Again, the range of growth alternatives looked at in the EIR. We have the no project, which in effect this is supposed to also be a continuation. And then there's the project. And I didn't prepare by looking at that specifically. I know it was here, but I don't want to say that just based on my recollection right now, if it's 1.5 or some lesser amount, the remaining 1.5. So we could look at this and provide you more detail in that regard.
Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy at 9 o'clock at night after 8 hours of hearing, so I give you more detail, but I just can't put my hands on it at this point.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
I too recall the conversation we had, David Gephardt, and the goals that the Commission was trying to achieve regarding jobs, housing, and the imbalance that exists now. The proposal before the Commission tonight is a maintenance of the status quo while we consider all of the ramifications of those proposals that you put forth and set in motion. As Commissioner Bartlett frequently mentions, we could make it zero. We could have no future, no more non-residential growth in this community and not even make a dent in the jobs housing imbalance without substantially increasing residential growth. And we can't do that without analyzing the environmental impacts of that activity. And so we're just not at a place where we can make a big dent or a big move one way or the other to tackle the jobs housing imbalance until we have the environmental document that you put into motion. The proposal before you right now is to maintain that status quo while we're trying to get that work done. And with the knowledge that we have regarding that status quo and how it's worked for the last 20 years, I think staff has been confident that we can put this as a placeholder so we can get that work done and then be in a place to make those decisions for the next 20 years.
Thank you, Mr. Vincent. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I understand the sentiments, but I think I have the opposite approach, and I appreciate Scott Vincent kind of reminding me of what I had said before. I think right now, obviously the housing market is dead, and if we want to balance, why do we have to now kill the commercial market too? So, I mean, there's a reason we have a surplus to carry over, and that's because we haven't used it all, and we're certainly not going to use it up in the next increment of time, but I would prefer to extend it for a shorter period of time to give us more impetus to finish Plan Santa Barbara. If we just automatically give it 5 years, we're just going to plod along and not have a real reason to do it. I'd rather do it for 3 years or whatever we think is more reasonable, not change the rules. We're certainly not going to max anything out. If something did go higher than what we're even anticipating, it might be a sign that maybe the economy's recovering. So, I mean, I don't think we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and I'd rather have a shorter time frame and force ourselves to get the real job done. So I'm not in favor of changing the rules. I just want to have less time that these temporary rules are going to be in place until we fix them.
Okay, I understand what Commissioner Jostes is saying, and I wish that what Commissioner Bartlett is saying were true, that if we set ourselves a short-term deadline, that would move us forward quicker, but I guess I am a little more cynical that that's going to happen. I understand what Ms. Weiss is saying about setting it far enough out that we don't have to do another interim ordinance because it's time-consuming and just another delay along the way. So, although I wish that we were not needing to do this because we had the general plan update completed and all this had been already hammered out, I understand the reason that we're doing it, and I would support what you're proposing to do. Now, we need to have I would assume we need to have a motion because you want a recommendation to go forward. So if there's no other discussion, I would look for a motion from somebody either to move forward with this or a recommendation that would move something forward. Mr. Jostes.
Mr. Chair, I find Mr. Bartlett's suggestion very, I think, relevant in terms of not going to 5 years. And right now we've got, we've got another 18 months until the end of this sunsets at December 31st, 2009 or 2010?
2009.
9. This year.
9.
This calendar
End
year.
of this year. That's why they're doing it now.
Well, I could certainly extend it for 2 years, but I wouldn't want to go any farther than that. And I think a 2-year time frame is consistent with the last update we had in terms of timing? That you were going to get through council.
Yes, in terms of the planned Santa Barbara schedule, I do believe, as I understand the schedule now, with conditions as well as I understand them now, the 2 years should be adequate. I do think so. But, you know, 2 years ago, I was telling you something different too. You know, I'm doing just the reality of it. And that was why, I mean, maybe we should compromise at 3. You know, just to give a little bit of a cushion. That's what it is. But my hope is that how this program needs to change will become evident certainly within the next year. I mean, that's why we're all doing this, Plan Santa Barbara. So anyway, consider a compromise, and we certainly would be supportive of that.
Okay. I would move for adjustments to the ordinances written to provide for a 2-year time frame.
So you would...
that way I'm out of office when this thing is done.
Yeah. So you would move it to January 1, 2012. It's 2 years.
I was thinking 2 years from the end of this year. So I guess that does...
January 1, 2012 is 2 years.
Yeah.
2-year extension.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's your motion.
I'll second that.
And a second, Commissioner Lodge, you had a comment?
Well, I was going to make a motion for 3 years, but we've got a motion on the floor.
Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Okay.
No.
We're recommending then to the Ordinance Committee that it move forward, but only with 2 years to January 1, 2012, not 5 years.
Thank you.
Maybe not what you wanted, but
That's okay.
they will probably discuss it and change it as they see fit.
Yes, I think the council will. And also, I'd be happy to provide the commission with more information about the square footages, you know, what's left in each category. And again, as sign of the times, we really haven't been using the small addition allocation every year. That's why the economic pot has grown so large. And the only economic development project pending is the Foothill Triangle. So even with the potential availability of the square footage, it may be that for the next year or so there isn't a lot of growth pressure for the non-residential. So I'd be happy to follow up with any additional information. If you think the council would like more information on that, I can supplement, you know, the report when it moves forward to them. And that would be our next step, to return to the City Council. Since the ordinance really isn't changing, we won't be returning. The Ordinance Committee will go to Council.
I would ask that the rationale for our recommended change to the timing be transmitted, that we're concerned that we lose the motion moving forward on the general plan update.
Yes.
And as Commissioner Bartlett expressed it, give ourselves a shorter term target to shoot for so that we don't just sit back and make it a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a few administrative items. We could defer that, but since there's nothing major, I would suggest we get through it, and we'll be finished with those and out of here. Committee and liaison reports. Do we have any? Seeing none. Decisions of the staff hearing officer. Danny, you gave us a summary at lunchtime. I don't know that we need to go over it again, unless anybody on the commission would like to review that. I know you weren't here, Commissioner Bartlett, but it was nothing controversial. Okay. Finally, action on the minutes and resolutions that were in your package.
There are a few typos, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Which
Page 3, third paragraph from the bottom, Mr. Eland's name is misspelled there. For some reason or other, it's spelled correctly elsewhere. Page 3, third from the bottom, it says Mr. Elin clarified. It should be L-E-N. And then on page 8, the first motion, it said this motion carried by the following vote, and it was a tie, so it should be this motion failed.
Where's that?
Page 8.
Oh, yeah.
And then page 10, the motion at the top, it says this motion carried by the following vote, ayes 5, noes 0, abstain 0, absent 1, and then it says Bartlett and Jacobs. Which was, were both of you here? Or, so it's either 2 or, it's 2, okay. Okay, that was all that I had.
Mr. Bartlett.
Mr. Chair, I need to abstain from all of these. Will we even have a quorum to vote on them tonight? I was not here for April 16th, so.
Well, I don't know. I guess voting on the minutes would be appropriate. I guess if you were here to.
Oh.
Yeah, if you were here. Let's. Okay.
Mr. Chair, move to continue this item until the next regular meeting of the Planning Commission.
Okay.
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. We'll carry that over. Take your minutes with you, and we'll bring them back at the next meeting. Anybody have any last items? Okay. We are adjourned. Thank you.